Introduction and Learning Objectives. Hello and welcome to the first lecture of the cost module. Let us start with what is cost. Cost is a basic yardstick by which activities and assets are measured and compared. Because the word cost is so commonly used and generally related to monetary value, we may lose sight of its true meaning and importance as a cost engineering concept. We all know cost is one of the three fundamental attributes associated with performing an activity or the acquisition of an asset. These three attributes are 1. Price, which relates to cost, 2. Features, which relates to performance, and 3. Availability, which relates to schedule. Now the question arises, what is cost engineering? Cost engineering is the application of scientific principles and techniques to problems of estimation, cost control, business planning and management science, profitability analysis, project management, and planning and scheduling. If you see that definition carefully, you will find that this definition seemingly addresses non-cost areas. However, it lists key engineering activities that either generate cost when they are performed or define plans or processes that cause or influence cost to be generated in other activities and or assets. Now, let's talk about the concepts we will cover in this lecture. This lecture will provide you with a basic understanding of cost fundamentals. In this lecture, we will understand what are the elements that make up cost, how are these cost elements categorized, and how do they relate to one another? Why is it important to collect and account for costs as they relate to specific activities and assets? And finally, how do we apply these cost elements and categories to the insight for managing activities and assets? After completing this lecture, you will be able to understand what makes up cost, i.e., the basic resources, material, labor, etc., that are needed to perform an activity or create an asset. Understand the distinction between cost elements that are directly applied to an asset and those that are indirectly applied. Relate the cost elements to the life cycle of the asset, acquisition, use, and disposal. Use the understanding of cost elements to further understand how cost is measured, applied, and recorded to arrive at the total activity and or asset cost, and apply the knowledge gained to solve problems related to cost element source and definition. Let us talk about cost concepts. Cost is the value of an activity or asset. Generally, this value is determined by the cost of the resources that are expended to complete the activity or produce the asset. Resources utilized are categories as material, labor, and other. Although money and time are sometimes thought of as resources, however, they only implement and or constrain the use of the physical resources just listed. Following figure shows the path by which resources are converted via a project to activities and assets. Let's understand the figure. At first, we have resources available. Then these resources are implemented by spending time and money. Expenditure of time and money is done through several cost elements, and at last, the asset is built or the activity is completed. The final activity or asset produced depends on what can be afforded given the money and time allocated to the project. If you are wondering what are cost elements, we will discuss them in details in a moment. Normally, we think of material as the physical composition of the asset. However, the value of the asset may also include the cost elements of scrap material or manufacturing spares, construction formwork, and expendable safety items, and the cost of transporting the material to the worksite, etc. Same way, we often think of labor as the value of the work needed to complete the activity or asset, i.e., the worker's labor in painting the building or soldering an electrical contact. But labor also includes the work of the engineer who prepares the design, the foreman supervising the field work, or the technician that maintains the equipment. The other cost category consists of resources needed to support the activity and or asset. An example would be the facilities needed to produce an activity or asset, which would include the tooling, electricity, taxes, and maintenance, etc., necessary to keep the facility available for use. Other costs might be office supplies, communication costs, travel costs, and security costs. We will cover all the cost element as we make progress through this module. It is important to further structure the cost elements within the material, labor, and other resource categories. This will allow us to understand how these costs influence the total cost of the activity or asset. Cost structuring will also provide understanding of how they can be controlled. This structuring sorts the cost elements into direct costs, indirect costs, fixed costs, and variable costs. In practice, some costs may fall in more than one of these groupings. We will review each cost group in great detail in next few slides. Direct costs are those resources that are expended solely to complete the activity or asset. In other words, direct cost is cost of all cost elements, which can be identified with a particular final cost objective. For example, the direct cost of a foundation shall include excavation for the footings, the forms, if not reusable, the concrete, and the labor to place and finish the concrete. Note that direct cost is not necessarily limited to those items that are incorporated in the end product as material or labor. Consumables are such type of direct costs. For example, formwork release agent. The formwork release agent is not finally incorporated in the concrete, but this is direct cost for any concrete product. Indirect costs are those resources that need to be expended to support the activity or asset, but that are also associated with other activities and assets. In other words, any cost not directly identified with a single final cost objective, but identified with two or more final cost objectives is indirect cost. Consequently, indirect costs are allocated to an activity or asset based upon some direct cost element, such as labor hours, material cost, or both. Indirect costs also may be referred to as overhead costs or burden costs. Indirect costs are general administrative activities associated with operating the business, costs for providing and maintaining field equipment or a manufacturing facility, and expenses for utilities, taxes, legal services, etc. Fixed costs. Fixed costs are those cost elements that must be provided independent of the volume of work activity or asset production that they support. These can be either direct or indirect costs. For concreting activity, cost of concrete pump, if owned by the contractor, is fixed cost. Why? Because the cost of concrete pump is fixed if we do 1000 cubic meter of concrete or 10,000 cubic meter of concrete a day, i.e., irrespective of volume of work done. Let us assume here that 10,000 cubic meter of concrete a day is maximum concrete pumping capacity. The tools used to finish the concrete are an indirect fixed cost since they can be reused on other concrete finishing work. Variable costs. Variable costs are those cost elements that must be provided. Variable costs are dependent on the volume of work activity or asset production that they support. Again, these can be either direct or indirect costs. An example of an indirect variable cost would be the cost of fuel used to operate the concrete pump, since it varies with the quantity of concrete pumped. In business practice, cost element information may be grouped in a variety of ways to provide the basis for management decisions. In next slides, we will understand these cost groupings through a detailed example. Let's take a simple example to understand cost element and cost structure. John decides to build a car park shade on the back of his house. This project would include concrete foundation and turpentine shade on top of the foundation. He draws up plans for the project, gets the building permit from the city, buys the material, hauls it home, and constructs the shade. Let's first see the cost element in this project. Materials, drafting, paper, pencil, concrete, nails, lumber, deck screws, paint, brushes, turpentine, drop cloth, labor, draw plans, get permit, get materials, construct footings, erect shade, paint shade, wife support in making lunch. Other, building permit fee, use of house to draw plans, shovel, power saw, power drill, electricity, pickup truck, fuel. We will understand cost structure in next slide. Let's understand the cost structure of John Carr Sunshade. The cost can be categorized in 4 heads of direct, indirect, fixed, and variable. Let's understand these elements one after other. Direct cost. This will have cost elements of material, labor, and other. Material consists of drafting paper, concrete, nails, lumber, deck screws, paint, turpentine. Labor consists of draw plans, get permit, get materials, construct footings, erect deck, paint. Other, building permit fee. Indirect cost. This will have cost elements of material, labor, and other. Material consists of pencil, brushes, drop cloth. Labor consists of wife support in making lunch. Other, use of house to draw plans, shovel, power saw, power drill, electricity, pickup truck, gasoline. Fixed cost. This will have direct and indirect categories. Under direct cost, we have get permit. Under indirect cost, we have use of house to draw plans, shovel, power saw, power drill, pickup truck, pencil, brushes, drop, cloth, variable. This will have direct and indirect categories. Under direct cost, we have drafting paper, building permit fee, concrete, nails, lumber, deck screws, paint, turpentine, draw plans, get materials, construct footings, erect deck, paint. Under indirect cost, we have wife support in making lunch, electricity, and fuel. What is the purpose of cost accounting and why is it important? Cost accounting is defined as the historical reporting of disbursements and costs and expenditures on a project. When used in conjunction with a current working estimate, cost accounting can assist in giving the precise status of the project to date. Historical costs can also provide a sound basis for forecasting and budgeting costs of future activities and assets. While detailed methods used for cost accounting may vary from business to business or from project to project, all accounting systems include the three basic steps of 1. Recording, 2. Classifying, and 3. Summarizing. Cost element data in terms of money expended with time. The recording of cost information is nothing more than the mechanical gathering of data in a routine manner. There are a variety of methods to achieve this. Generally, it's accomplished with timesheets for labor and invoices for subcontracts and procured items. Other costs are gathered from utility bills, expense reports, tax bills, etc. Code of accounts. Every business enterprise has an established approach for classifying and summarizing costs that is organized around their business practices. This approach is called a code of accounts, by which all recorded cost elements are classified. A code of accounts, sometimes referred to as a chart of accounts, is a systematic numeric method of classifying various categories of costs incurred in the progress of a job, the segregation of engineering, procurement, fabrication, construction, and associated project costs for accounting purposes. A company's code of accounts is configured to support the recording of cost data in the general ledger. An example of summary level accounts is shown on screen. If you see this accounts code on the screen, you will observe that the codes are based upon the accounting principle and the construction activities. These codes are generally dependent on the company business and accounting principles. Other cost accounting methods. Activity-based costing. While classifying costs in accordance with the general ledger breakout is a common practice, this approach does not generally provide the visibility needed to manage the work or to make informed forecasts of the cost of new jobs. Activity-based costing, ABC, is a special costing model that identifies activities in an organization and assigns the cost of each activity with resources to all products and services according to the actual consumption by each. This model assigns more indirect costs, overhead, into direct costs compared to conventional costing models. ABC makes cost accounts understandable and logical and much more useful for the cost engineer. This method of collecting and summarizing cost elements reveals which resources and activities are the most significant contributors, drivers to the cost of the cost objective. We will discuss this method in more detail in later chapters of this course. WBS-based costing. Another approach to classifying costs that is similar to ABC accounting is using a work breakdown structure, WBS, to group cost elements. It has become a common practice for a WBS to be a required project management tool on most contracts. Not only does a WBS provide a framework for planning and controlling the resources needed to perform the technical objectives, but it facilitates a summary of project data regarding the cost and schedule performance. When used to classify and record costs, the WBS becomes the cost element structure, CS, as well. Sometimes the code of accounts to be used is determined by law and accounting practice of the country. Study of these accounting practices are specialized subjects in commerce and accounting field. Regardless of how cost elements are classified and grouped, it is important that this is done in a manner that it is consistent with the way future work is estimated and budgeted. Historical cost records represent the way a company conducts its business and can be analyzed to determine whether improvements have been made and how costs may trend in the future. Therefore, the integrity of the cost accounting system is essential to developing a project cost baseline. Cost management. There are many ways that cost elements and cost structure can be displayed to provide information for cost management. We will consider 4 of the most common methods of how cost information is applied to cost management. These are 1. Cost estimating, 2. Cost trending, 3. Cost forecasting, and 4. Life cycle costing. Although these methods will be discussed in more detail in later lectures, it is important to see how they relate to cost elements and structure. Let's understand these methods in brief in next few slides. Cost estimating. Cost estimating predicts the quantity and cost of resources needed to accomplish an activity or create an asset. The building blocks of a cost estimate are a well-defined scope, what we are trying to estimate, a cost element structure, how we organize the information, and historical cost data, data from cost accounting records and or experience of knowledgeable people. Key questions to ask regarding a cost estimate always include what cost data was used and how can we reduce the cost of X. Therefore, cost element data and its structure are paramount ingredients of a sound cost estimate. Cost trending. Cost trends are established from historical cost accounting information. Cost trending focuses on answering how expenditures are trending relative to physical accomplishments. How much are we spending for pipe fitters and how much piping has been installed during the last 6 months? Or what has been our monthly cost for steel last year and how many bowls have we produced? Again, having access to cost history and the structure needed is key to providing the required information. Cost forecasting. Forecasts are much like estimates. Whereas an estimate is always for future activities and assets, forecasts are predictions of the cost at completion for cost elements in progress. Therefore, a sound cost forecast will be based on cost element data from inception of the work to the date of the forecast, the cost trend of that data compared to accomplishments, and a cost estimate of the work remaining to be completed. Cost element history in the proper activity structure is essential for realistic cost forecasts. Life cycle costing. Life cycle costs, LCC, are associated with an asset and extend the cost management information beyond the acquisition, creation of the asset to the use and disposal of the asset. Asset acquisition consists of the design development phase and the production construction phase. Generally, cost elements are segregated into these phases because design development costs are often recovered over more than one asset. For example, design and development cost of a new airplane is amortized over the production. The design of a housing project is recovered through sales of the houses built. In this lecture, we have studied some of the fundamental aspects of cost. We started with an understanding of DAPU, resources, and cost elements, and how they relate to the performance of activities and the creation of an asset. Money and time we introduced as both enablers of and constraints on the execution of a project. Cost elements were illustrated by an example of building a car shade. Next, we considered how cost elements are structured into direct, indirect, fixed, and variable cost groups. The purpose for organizing costs into groups is to determine which cost elements are used in performing the activity or creating the asset and which are in support of the work. Other possible groupings were introduced to illustrate how cost elements can be arranged to provide visibility on the cost of specific activities or resources. The importance of cost accounting in establishing a database for cost management was discussed. Several methods of classifying and summarizing cost elements were introduced: code of accounts, activity-based costing, and work breakdown structure WBS. Finally, the topic of cost management was introduced. 4 common methods for providing cost information were discussed as they applied to cost management. This illustrated the importance of having sound cost history that is structured in a usable format.